The colonel told the old man to stay in the regular line. He said it politely. He said it quickly. He said it the way busy men say things when they have already decided who matters and who can wait. 30 minutes later, that same colonel would stand in front of hundreds of people with an old leather journal shaking in his hand, unable to look that old man in the eye. Fort Ashford's annual Legacy Day ceremony had begun under a pale Virginia sun. Flags lined the stone walkway. A military band warmed up near the main pavilion. Families moved between photo displays, coffee tables, and rows of folding chairs set beneath white canopies. It was supposed to be a day of remembrance. A day when names were spoken slowly and service was treated with care. Near the end of the entrance line stood Robert Hayes. He was 82 years old, though he did not carry himself like a man asking the world to feel sorry for him. His gray jacket had been brushed clean. His shoes were polished, but old enough to show the crease of many years. A wooden cane rested in his right hand, not as a decoration, and not as a request for attention. It was simply there, like the quiet patience in his face. He had a folded invitation in his pocket. No blue lanyard. No special badge. No row number printed in gold. No one met him at the gate. No one called his name. And Robert Hayes seemed perfectly fine with that. He watched the flags move in the wind. He watched young volunteers help older veterans with clipboards. He watched grandsons take photographs of grandfathers beside display boards. Every once in a while, his eyes drifted toward the administration tent at the far side of the courtyard. That was where Colonel Daniel Mercer had just arrived. Mercer stepped out of a black sport utility vehicle wearing a service uniform so sharp it seemed to belong to the ceremony itself. At 56, he had the controlled energy of a man who had spent most of his adult life being responsible for more than he could safely admit. His Silver Eagle insignia caught the morning light. Staff officers moved toward him with schedules and questions before he had even closed the vehicle door. The keynote speaker is early, sir. The press crew wants to move the camera platform. General Whitaker's party needs front row access. Mercer listened, nodded, and made decisions without slowing down. He was not cruel. He was not careless by nature. But he was under pressure, and pressure had a way of turning people into the hardest version of themselves. A young volunteer hurried beside him. "Sir, we have more attendees than expected. The registration line is backed up." "Keep it moving," Mercer said. "Some of the older veterans have been waiting close to 40 minutes. Mercer looked at his watch. "Priority guests first. We cannot delay the ceremony." He passed along the line, returning nods from veterans without stopping. Then he reached Robert Hayes. "Sir, registration card." Robert took the folded invitation from his jacket pocket and handed it over with a steady hand. Mercer read it. "Standard admission. Guest of public invitation. No special notation. Not a speaker. Not a honoree. Not a distinguished visitor. You will need to remain in line," Mercer said. Robert nodded once. Of course. There was no complaint in the answer. No sarcasm. No appeal to age. No attempt to explain himself. Mercer handed the invitation back and moved on. Behind him, Captain Ethan Brooks had seen the exchange. Brooks was 31, young enough to still notice details that older officers sometimes trained themselves to ignore. He respected Colonel Mercer. Most people did. Mercer was disciplined, organized, and usually fair. But as Brooks looked at the old man in the gray jacket, something about the moment did not sit right. Robert did not look embarrassed. He did not look angry. He looked at Mercer's nameplate. Daniel Mercer. For 1 second, Robert's expression changed. A small smile touched the corner of his mouth. Not amusement. Not bitterness. Recognition. Then it vanished. Brooks followed Mercer toward the administration tent, but he glanced back twice. The old man had returned to his quiet waiting, cane planted lightly against the pavement, eyes on the flags. Inside the tent, Legacy Day was turning into controlled disorder. Folding tables were covered with seating charts, radio batteries, name cards, and program booklets. A framed photograph of Fort Ashford from the 1980s leaned against a supply crate, waiting to be placed near the archive display. Mercer moved from one issue to the next. He handled the camera platform. He rearranged 2 retired officers. He approved the band's timing. He corrected a mistake in the ceremony order. Through it all, he carried an old leather journal tucked beneath his arm. The journal did not match the rest of him. Everything else about Mercer looked polished and official. The journal looked worn, private, and almost out of place. The leather had darkened with age. The corners had softened. A thin strap held it closed, though the strap had cracked in 2 places. Captain Brooks had seen it before. Mercer brought it to every major ceremony. No one knew exactly why. Some assumed it was a habit. Some thought it held speaking notes. The truth was that Mercer carried it because he had carried it for so long he no longer knew how to attend a day of remembrance without it. Outside, the line moved forward in uneven waves. Robert advanced a few feet, then stopped again. A volunteer approached him with a concerned smile. "Sir, would you like a chair while you wait?" "That is kind of you," Robert said, "but I am fine. It may still be another 30 minutes. Robert looked toward the main pavilion and gave a soft nod. "I have waited longer." The volunteer smiled politely, unsure whether he meant the line, the ceremony, or something else. Captain Brooks, who had stepped outside to confirm the seating change, heard the answer. "I have waited longer." There are certain words that sound ordinary until the wrong person says them. Then they carry weight. Brooks walked over. "Good morning, sir. I am Captain Ethan Brooks." Robert turned toward him. "Morning, Captain. I hope the delay has not been too frustrating." "Not at all. Most people would disagree." Robert's eyes warmed slightly. "Most people spend too much time fighting clocks." Brooks laughed despite himself. "Have you attended Legacy Day before?" "Not this one." "What brought you here?" Robert looked past the entrance, toward the pavilion where the first rows had been roped off for honored guests. "An old promise," he said. Brooks waited for more, but Robert gave him nothing else. At that moment, a gust of wind swept across the registration table. Program pages lifted and scattered over the pavement. Volunteers scrambled after them. One sheet slid to a stop near Robert's shoes. He bent slowly, picked it up, and handed it back. "No harm done," he said. The volunteer thanked him and hurried away. Brooks noticed Robert's eyes drift again toward the administration tent. Not toward the event, not toward the front row, but toward the place where Colonel Mercer had disappeared. Inside that tent, Mercer reached for an updated seating list. As he lifted the papers, the old leather journal slipped from beneath his arm and landed open on the table. For a moment, no one noticed. Then a loose page slid free from between 2 sections and turned face up. Mercer looked down. The handwriting was his own, but younger. Less controlled. Written by a man who had not yet learned how heavy leadership could become. He picked up the page. The date at the top was more than 3 decades old. He almost put it back. There was no time for memory. The ceremony was minutes behind. A retired general was waiting. A public affairs officer needed approval for a local news interview. Then his eyes caught a name. Robert Hayes. Mercer stopped moving. The tent did not become quiet, but it felt that way to him. Radios continued to crackle. Officers continued to speak. Papers continued to move. Yet for one strange second, all of it seemed to take place behind glass. He read the first line. Sergeant Robert Hayes sat with me tonight when I did not know how to lead my own men. Mercer's thumb tightened against the paper. He read the next line. He told me the men do not need perfection. They need someone who cares enough to keep trying. Mercer sat down. An aide approached. Sir, they are asking for final confirmation on the guest order. Mercer did not answer. The memory came back slowly at first, then all at once. He was 24 again. A new lieutenant with clean boots and too much pride, posted at Fort Ashford before his first major overseas assignment. He had been smart, prepared, and terrified that everyone knew he was pretending to be more confident than he felt. He remembered a late evening outside a temporary operations building. He remembered cold coffee in a paper cup. He remembered a steady voice beside him. Sergeant Hayes. Not loud. Not polished. Not interested in impressing anyone. Just steady. Hayes had been the kind of non-commissioned officer young officers either feared, resented, or thanked years later. Mercer had done all three at different times. Hayes corrected him without humiliating him. Challenged him without making him small. Protected his authority in front of the unit, then told him the truth when they were alone. The page in Mercer's hand had more. If I ever become the kind of officer people salute because they have to instead of because they trust me, I hope I remember this night. Below that, in firmer block letters, he had written one final sentence. If I ever see Robert Hayes again, thank him properly. Mercer stared at the sentence. Thank him properly. The words felt less like a note and more like a witness. He stood so quickly that the chair scraped against the tent floor. Get me the registration list. The aide blinked. Sir. The full list. Now. A minute later, a tablet appeared in his hand. Mercer scrolled through names with a kind of urgency that made the staff around him fall silent. His eyes moved down the screen. Hayes, Robert. Age 82. United States Army, retired. Standard admission. Arrived 1 hour and 56 minutes ago. Mercer looked up from the screen. Nearly 2 hours. While he had walked past. While he had sorted rows by importance. While he had sent dignitaries ahead and told an old man to remain in line. The journal felt heavier than it had ever felt before. Captain Brooks entered the tent just as Mercer closed it. Sir. Mercer's face had changed. The irritation was gone. The command mask was still there, but something had cracked beneath it. Captain, how long has Mr. Hayes been waiting? Brooks answered carefully. Almost 2 hours, sir. Mercer nodded as if he already knew and still needed to hear it spoken. Do you know him? Brooks asked. Mercer looked toward the open tent flap. Outside, beyond the moving figures, Robert Hayes stood near the registration point with his visitor badge now clipped to his jacket. He made no move toward the pavilion. He simply waited, as though the whole morning had been leading to this. Mercer said, I should have known him the moment I saw him. Brooks did not ask another question. Mercer opened the journal again as he walked. The courtyard seemed larger than before. Guests were finding seats. A narrator tested the microphone. The band's brass notes rose and fell in the breeze. Volunteers moved along the aisles with programs. None of them understood why the colonel had left the administration tent with an old journal pressed against his chest. But people notice when authority changes direction. One officer stopped speaking. A volunteer lowered her clipboard. Several veterans turned their heads. Mercer walked past the front row, past the press platform, past the roped entrance for distinguished guests, and headed straight toward the old man in the gray jacket. Robert saw him coming. He did not straighten dramatically. He did not smile wide. He did not prepare a speech. He only shifted his cane to his left hand and waited. Mercer stopped a few feet away. For several seconds, neither man spoke. The silence was not empty. It held 30 years. Mercer looked at the face in front of him, then at the name on the visitor badge, then down at the journal. Age had changed Robert Hayes, but not the steadiness in his eyes. The same calm was there. The same patience that had once steadied a young lieutenant who thought fear made him unworthy. Finally Mercer said, quietly, "Sergeant Hayes." The words carried farther than he expected. Several people nearby heard them. Brooks heard them. A few veterans in line turned fully around. Robert's faint smile returned. "It has been a long time, Lieutenant." "Lieutenant." "Not Colonel." "Not sir." The single word moved through the courtyard like a key turning in an old lock. Mercer lowered his eyes for a moment, not from shame exactly, but from the weight of being recognized by someone he had failed to recognize first. "You knew me this morning," he said. The nameplate helped. "And you said nothing." Robert gave a small shrug. "I figured you would remember eventually." A few people smiled at that, but no one laughed loudly. They understood, even without the details, that the old man had offered grace before anyone had asked for it. Mercer opened the journal and turned it toward him. "I have carried this for 30 years. Robert looked at the worn cover. "It looks like it survived better than we did." This time, the laughter was gentle and brief. Mercer looked at the page again. His voice changed when he read from it. It was not the voice he used to give orders. It was lower, more careful. "Sergeant Robert Hayes sat with me tonight when I did not know how to lead my own men." The people nearest them grew still. Mercer continued. "He told me the men do not need perfection. They need someone who cares enough to keep trying." Robert's eyes moved from the journal to the flags above the pavilion. His face remained composed, but his fingers tightened once around the handle of his cane. Mercer swallowed. "I wrote one more thing." He looked at Robert. "If I ever see Robert Hayes again, thank him properly." The courtyard had gone quiet now. The microphone at the pavilion gave a low hum. The band stopped warming up. Conversations ended in rows, then in small clusters, then across the walkway. Robert looked uncomfortable for the first time all morning. "Colonel," he said softly, "you do not need to do all this." Mercer shook his head. "Yes, I do." Robert's voice stayed calm. "I came to keep a promise, not collect a debt." "What promise?" For a moment, Robert did not answer. He looked toward the archive display near the pavilion. On one table sat photographs from Fort Ashford's past. Training classes. Unit ceremonies. Retirement events. Young faces captured before years changed them. A framed list of past Legacy Day honorees stood near the center. Robert's name was not on it. He noticed that. So did Mercer. Robert finally said, "There was a young lieutenant who once told me he would not forget where he learned to lead. I came to see whether he had kept his word." The word struck Mercer harder than an accusation. Would have. Because they were not bitter. They were simply true. Brooks saw Mercer look down at the journal again. He saw the colonel's jaw tighten, not with anger, but with a kind of inward correction. A public affairs officer approached carefully. "Sir, the ceremony is ready to begin." Mercer did not look away from Robert. "Yes," he said. "It is." He turned toward the pavilion and spoke clearly enough for the nearby staff to hear. "Hold the program." The officer hesitated. "Sir." "Hold the program." The command moved fast. A hand signal went to the band. The announcer stepped back from the microphone. The first row of distinguished guests looked toward Mercer with mild confusion. Mercer faced Captain Brooks. "Captain, bring the legacy book." Brooks moved at once. The legacy book was not part of the public display at first. It was a large bound volume kept by the Fort Ashford Historical Office, signed by honorees, commanders, and families of veterans whose service had shaped the post. It was ceremonial, yes, but to the people who cared about such things, it mattered. Names placed inside it were read every year. Names in that book did not disappear easily. When Brooks returned with the book, Mercer placed the leather journal beside it on a small table near the front of the pavilion. The contrast between them was striking. One book official and polished. One book private and worn. One held the record people saw. One held the truth someone almost forgot. Mercer stepped to the microphone. Hundreds of faces turned toward him. Veterans in ball caps. Wives holding programs. Sons and daughters leaning forward. Active duty soldiers standing near the back. Reporters lifting cameras. Mercer did not begin with the scheduled greeting. "This morning," he said, "I made a mistake." That sentence alone changed the air. Commanders rarely began ceremonies by admitting mistakes. Mercer continued. "A man arrived here almost 2 hours ago. He stood in our regular line with no complaint. He was given no special seat, no escort, no public welcome, even though I had carried his name with me for more than 30 years. Robert stood at the edge of the pavilion, visibly uneasy. He looked like a man who would rather step backward than become the center of anything. Mercer lifted the old journal. "When I was a young lieutenant, I believed leadership came from rank, preparation, and being right. Sergeant Robert Hayes taught me something different. He taught me that men follow steadiness. They follow fairness. They follow the person who remembers that every order lands on a human being." The crowd turned toward Robert. He did not lower his head. He did not raise his chin. He simply stood there with his cane in his left hand and his right hand resting at his side. Mercer's voice tightened slightly. "I wrote in this journal that if I ever saw him again, would thank him properly." He paused. "I saw him this morning and did not recognize him." The honesty landed heavily. No one moved. Mercer looked at Robert directly. "Sergeant Hayes, that failure was mine." Robert's lips parted as if to stop him, but Mercer continued before he could speak. "And I will not let this ceremony continue until it is corrected." He looked down at the official legacy book. "The published program does not list your name. The front row did not reserve your seat. That changes now." He opened the book to a blank page. "Captain Brooks." Brooks stepped forward, pen in hand. Mercer spoke into the microphone. "Enter this name into the Fort Ashford Legacy Book, Sergeant Robert Hayes, United States Army, retired. Mentor, leader, and living example of quiet service." Brooks wrote slowly, carefully, each letter large enough for those closest to see. "Robert Hayes." For the first time, Robert's steady expression broke. Not much. Not in a way that looked theatrical. His eyes lowered, and his hand trembled once against the cane. He pressed his thumb into the wood until the moment passed. Mercer saw it. So did many in the crowd. There are moments when applause would be too early. The audience seemed to understand that. Mercer stepped away from the microphone and walked back to Robert. He stopped before him, standing straight, but without the distance of rank. "Sergeant Hayes," he said, "there is someone sitting in the wrong seat today." A quiet murmur moved through the pavilion. Mercer turned and pointed toward the front row. "You should have been there from the beginning." Robert looked toward the seat, then back at Mercer. "You know I was fine in the back." "I know. I was fine standing in line." "I know that too." Robert's mouth lifted in the faintest smile. "Then this is for you." Mercer nodded. "Maybe it is. But it is also for every man who taught someone and never knew whether the lesson survived." Robert looked at him for a long second. Then he gave one slow nod. The path opened before anyone ordered it. Veterans shifted aside. Families stood. A young volunteer removed the rope from the front section. Captain Brooks walked on Robert's right, close enough to help if needed, far enough not to rob him of dignity. Mercer walked on his left, carrying the old journal like evidence. Robert moved slowly down the aisle. Every step seemed to gather silence around it. When he reached the front row, General Whitaker, who had been seated in the center, stood immediately. "No, sir," Robert said. "Please." The general shook his head and gestured to the chair. "Sergeant, I think the colonel is right." Robert lowered himself into the seat. Mercer remained standing before him. For a moment, the two men looked at each other as the flags moved behind them. Then Mercer did something not written in any schedule. He brought his right hand up in a slow, formal salute. The entire pavilion seemed to hold its breath. Robert looked at him, and in his eyes was the burden of a man who had spent most of his life avoiding exactly this kind of attention. But there was something else too. Relief, maybe. Or the quiet ache of finally being seen without having to ask. His hand rose. It was slower than Mercer's. A little unsteady. But it was clean, deliberate, and exact. He returned the salute. Across the pavilion, chairs scraped back. One veteran stood. Then another. Then a family near the center. Then a row of soldiers at the rear. Within seconds, the entire crowd was on its feet. No one shouted. No one tried to turn the moment into entertainment. They simply stood because there are times when standing is the only proper language left. Captain Brooks felt his throat tighten. He looked at the name in the legacy book, still fresh in ink, and then at the old leather journal beside it. He understood then that history was not always lost because no one cared. Sometimes it was lost because the people who carried it were too humble to raise their hands. Mercer lowered his salute. Robert lowered his. The applause came gently at first, then grew, not wild, not noisy, but full. It sounded less like celebration than gratitude. Robert looked down for a moment. When he looked back up, Mercer was holding the journal out to him. Robert frowned slightly. "That belongs to you. It carried your name long enough in private," Mercer said. "I would like you to hold it while they read it into the record." Robert shook his head. "No. You keep it." Mercer did not move. Robert placed his hand over the cover, not taking it, only touching it. "You kept the promise better than you think," Robert said. Mercer's eyes glistened, but he kept his voice steady. "I made you wait 2 hours." Robert looked toward the crowd, then at the book, then back at the officer who had once been a frightened young lieutenant. "And then you remembered in front of everyone." Mercer had no answer. The ceremony resumed, but it was no longer the ceremony printed in the program. The announcer read Robert Hayes's name first. He did not read a list of medals. He did not exaggerate a battlefield legend. He did not turn Robert into something larger than a man. He read the words Mercer had requested. Mentor. Leader. Living example of quiet service. That was enough. As the band played, Robert sat in the front row with both hands resting on his cane. He did not wave. He did not pose. He did not try to become the story. Yet every person watching understood that he had become the reason the day mattered. After the ceremony, people approached him slowly. Older veterans first. Then younger soldiers. Then families. A young sergeant asked, "Sir, what did you tell him back then?" Robert looked at Mercer, who stood a few feet away, pretending not to listen. Robert smiled. "I told him not to confuse being in charge with being worth following." The young sergeant nodded as if he had just been handed something useful. Captain Brooks wrote that line down. Near the archive table, the historical officer placed a copy of Mercer's journal entry beside the open legacy book. The old private note and the new official record sat together where everyone could see them. Not to make a monument out of one man, but to remind the post that quiet service often survives first in memory, then in gratitude, and only later in ink. As the sun lowered toward the trees, Mercer and Robert stood near the walkway where the morning had begun. The line was gone now. The rope had been taken down. The scattered leaves still moved across the pavement. Mercer looked at the entrance and shook his head. "I should have stopped when I first saw you." Robert leaned lightly on his cane. "You were busy. That does not excuse it." "No," Robert said. "But remembering gives a man a chance to make it right." Mercer nodded slowly. For a while they watched the flags. Then Robert reached into his jacket pocket and removed the folded invitation. The edges had softened from being handled. He held it out. Mercer looked confused. "What is this?" "My regular admission," Robert said. Mercer almost smiled. "You want me to keep it?" "I want you to remember what it looked like when the name was ordinary." Mercer took the invitation carefully. Robert tapped the old journal beneath Mercer's arm. "And what it meant when it was not." Neither man spoke for several seconds. Finally Mercer said, "Thank you, Sergeant Hayes." Robert looked at him with the same calm that had unsettled Captain Brooks all morning. "You already said that." "Not enough." Robert's faint smile returned. "Then live it." Those two words stayed with Mercer longer than the applause. Longer than the ceremony. Longer than the photographs taken that afternoon. Live it. Years later, Captain Ethan Brooks would tell younger officers about that legacy day at Fort Ashford. He would tell them about the old man who waited in line without complaint. About the colonel who opened a journal and found a promise he had written before he understood how much promises could cost. About the name that moved from a private page into a public book. But he would always end the story the same way. Some heroes do not arrive with medals shining on their chest. Some arrive with a worn cane, a folded invitation, and the patience to wait until the truth catches up. And when it does, the right thing is simple. Stand up. Say the name. And salute.